Welcome to In Focus. I'm Juanita Tautungi. There is a crime robbing victims of their most basic human right, and it's happening right here in our country, mostly towards our Indigenous women and girls. Public Safety Canada defines human trafficking as one of the most heinous crimes imaginable, often described as modern-day slavery. Mostly women, even children, including boys, are forced into the sex trade. Perpetrators profiting off their victims using intimidation tactics. Today, we're putting human trafficking in focus. How can we stop this? Where can victims go for help? We want you to join in on our conversation. Our phone lines are open. Call us toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. You can also tweet us at APTN InFocus and use the hashtag Trafficking in Focus. Before I introduce you to our guests, here's part of the trailer for the documentary called Human Trafficking, Canada's Secret Shame. Let's set the scene.
Pretty much lured me in. I pretended that he was my boyfriend, bought me all kinds of nice things, took me out to nice dinners, and then eventually all of that stopped.
What I want Canadians to know is that this is not an abstract, distant activity out of movies, that this is very real and shockingly domesticated and shockingly normal looking in our society, to the point where many people don't recognize it when it's right beside them.
Girls have been victimized for so long that they have had their power taken away. They have had decisions made for them their entire lives for the most part. And starting to reclaim their own power and their own voice is critical to their healing.
She had no family. Everybody in her life had been isolated from her. No friends. She had nobody to contact.
We need to have a very strong partnership with all the police officers around the country, but even more important than that, we need to have a really strong partnership with our schools, with the health centers, with the youth centers. So you need to raise awareness through education.
And when you find out that your child is being trafficked at age 12, and you hear that the worst thing you could imagine has happened to you, has happened to someone you love, your child. It's so unfathomable. It's like your brain won't take in the information. And how can this possibly be?
And that's the trailer for this documentary called Human Trafficking, Canada's Secret Shame. And joining us now is Joy Smith from the Joy Smith Foundation, a frontline organization based here in Winnipeg that rescues and rehabilitates survivors. It was her foundation that released this documentary. Thank you for being here today, Joy.
Thank you.
And Alaya McIvor.
Hey.
She is a survivor from human trafficking and a member of the Sandy Bay First Nation. Thank you for being here today. And in Sault Ste. Marie, joining us by Skype is Marley Day. She's one of the founders of a grandmother's group that raises awareness on human trafficking. Hello, Marley.
Hi.
Thank you to all my guests here today. Let's begin with you, Joy. Let's talk about this documentary. What made you create, or what made you want to create this documentary?
I didn't want the survivors' voices to go away. And I wanted to educate Canada, Canadians, everybody, that human trafficking happens every single day. Our children are being bought and sold every single day, and people are accepting that. I wanted them to understand that these girls or boys who were servicing men or women sexually, often, the majority of the time, they were coerced into doing that. Underage children do not make the decision to sexually service men and women. So human trafficking I had to have a real world, a real documentary that showed real Canadians, not actors, not someone from another country. It had to be Canadians. You had to see and hear what was happening, and you had to protect your own families. I felt Canadians had to protect their own families from these predators. So it's an educational documentary, and it's having an impact all across the country.
It's a very heavy topic to talk about. It's a good topic to talk about because it is happening here in our country. Can you tell us what is your connection to human trafficking?
Well, I've worked with survivors for over 20 years, and it was brought to my attention long ago through my son, who worked in the ICE unit, and his heart was so broken by so many children who were lured over the internet. But when I started, I was a teacher at the time, math and science teacher, and I started giving seminars on how to protect your children from the internet, and the girls and the boys started showing up. And they showed me their tattoos, and they told me who they belonged to. It was just shocking, and that's what started the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, another question I have about the documentary, the title, Human Trafficking, Canada's Secret Shame. Mm-hmm. Why did you decide to call it that?
Because it is Canada's secret shame. It definitely is. Any Canadian who turns their eyes, or any John who services himself with a man or a woman, anybody like that, it's their shame. It's their shame because they change lives. With young children, the daughter who leaves home and gets involved in this kind of thing is never the same daughter who comes back. And if she does come back, there's a long road to counseling and rehabilitation. Often a lot of the young people miss years of education. They have a huge gap, and so later on they have trouble getting employment. But the number of murdered missing women, the number of people who disappear, I know in my heart, from what I've seen and what I've experienced, that a large majority of this is human trafficking. And people can't be dumbed down to the lowest common denominator. People are sacred. People are, children are to be protected and kept safe. Nobody, you know, you see these beautiful young women and these lovely young men, and a perpetrator gets a hold of them, and their whole lives change. They get mixed up in who they are and what they are, and if they have any self-worth. It's a travesty. It is Canada's secret shame. And now it's not any secret anymore.
Mm. Talk about why it's important to get the word out there.
For families to protect themselves. You know, I passed 2 laws in Parliament. They actually made Canadian history. And simply because there were no laws in Canada like that. But when I went to Parliament, a lot of people didn't believe human trafficking really happened. And I couldn't understand that because I've been working with the victims and survivors for 10 years before I went to Parliament. I was in Parliament 11 years and 4 months. And I got all that done. But the fact of the matter is, it isn't enough. This documentary had to be made. It couldn't be a documentary with actors. It couldn't be a documentary from some other country. We have to get down to the reality. It happens right here in the true North, strong and free. It's modern day slavery. And so education, I came to understand, is our greatest weapon. We need to educate every man, woman and child about human trafficking. I have a school program out now. It's going to be announced soon. It's out. Some schools are using it, grade 8 to 12. And you know, we have the smartest kids in the world. But our responsibility as Canadians and as parents and as adults is to protect our young. Any nation who doesn't do that always goes down.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. In the documentary, you say that it's Indigenous women and girls that, you know, that they make up a huge population of the victims. How do you know that?
I know that they're overrepresented. And not in every province, but in most provinces where you have a high Indigenous population, that's where you see that they're overrepresented, both in the male and female aspect. I know that because of the numbers that you see. And right now, the laws in Canada are new. People forget that it takes about 10 years, a decade, for people to learn about human trafficking, for judges to understand how they make judgments on the perpetrators, how lawyers need to get educated as to what it is. And so now Canada, you're hearing about human trafficking all over the place because Canadians are becoming educated. But within a large sector, a large number of Aboriginal, indigenous children are being targeted. And I think it's because, well, my own son's married to an Ojibwe girl, so I've got all my grandchildren or most of my grandchildren are half indigenous, half white. And I have to say, it's going to show a bias here, but they're the kindest, most wonderful, giving people. And it's their nature, it's just their God-given nature. Not everybody is, I mean, everybody is different. But you know, every group in our country has a certain characteristic, and one of theirs is one of kindness and trust. Mm-hmm. And so the perpetrators find that very attractive, mm-hmm. because you get these beautiful young Indigenous women who are trusting, and so they fall for someone who is, you know, showering them with gifts, and any girl does. It's not just Indigenous girls, many girls. It happens to anyone whose girl is at risk. Anyone who's a young boy is at risk.
And we're going to talk later in the show just about preventative measures for people to keep an eye out for. And Alaya, I'm eager to get to your story, but I also want to acknowledge Marley, who is joining us by Skype in Sault Ste. Marie. Marley, can you just tell us about this group of grandmothers that you are a part of?
Well, we came together a couple of years ago because there's such an issue here in Ontario. And right here in Sault Ste. Marie, we have a hub here because of the International Bridge.
And your group held a 3-day event last week. So what were some of those highlights?
Well, we had Diane Red Sky come to present, and also Dr. Sheila Smith from United Nations. And she tells me that right across the nation, there's the highest is the Aboriginal women to be trafficked.
And we were just talking about that with Joy as well. So, Marley, I'm curious to know if you know of the factors that make Indigenous women and girls more vulnerable to human trafficking. What are those factors?
Well, it's because of the trauma that we're still dealing with, and because of the poverty and the vulnerability of when these girls come from up north, these people are waiting for them to lure them into human trafficking.
And just to let our viewers know, right now they're seeing a clip of the walk that was held in Sault Ste. Marie by the group. Let's go back to the documentary now, and let's go to a clip from Steve Bell and how he felt when he found out that his daughter was being trafficked.
And when you find out that your child is being trafficked at age 12, and you hear that the worst thing you could imagine has happened to you, has happened to someone you love, your child, it's so unfathomable. It's like your brain won't take in the information. And how can this possibly be? You know, we live in a safe house, we have cars, we have money in the bank. This isn't, you know what I mean? Like how did this happen? And yet it did. And then when you realize that there's no quick escape. This was a decade long thing before she really got out of it. And it's such a staggering piece of information to absorb. And there's guilt, and there's all that. Like it's almost like dealing with someone who has suicided. How could we have prevented it? You kind of go through all that. What could we have done? What did we do wrong? And that's really not the issue. It's really not the issue. What we have is an environment where people choose to exploit. They naturally choose to exploit the most vulnerable because that's the easiest way they can get away with it.
Very powerful clip there. And Alaya, I want to bring you into the conversation now. And if you're listening to the clip, I'm sure you could relate to what he was saying, because you yourself are, now you're a survivor of human trafficking. So how did you become a victim?
So first and foremost, before we start the conversation off, prior to you, talking about the clip, you used sex trade, and also the language, John. That language needs to shift. That narrative really needs to shift, because now if you're using that language, the sex trade, first but foremost, it's not a trade. It's an industry, right? So we really need to be very clear on that, because if we're not clear on that, we're actually engaging in those behaviors of those perpetrators/abusers, right? So for myself, being a victim to this crime, what do you call it? I was, I come from a northern community, and one of the things in my northern community, I was put in the child welfare system here in Canada, which is today still failing families and other victims of human trafficking and sexual exploitation rapidly. So I was put in the care of Child and Family Services in my home community, which my Child and Family Service worker purchased me a Greyhound ticket to Winnipeg. So that's where all my victimization started. And prior before that was child sexual abuse that kind of like started that off. So one of the things, I was a young victim prior before that, already to being groomed to the sex industry. So then coming into Winnipeg and into a place where I wasn't aware of, it was sort of a culture shock to me, coming from a northern community, a First Nations community. It was a culture shock, and no one was to receive me on the other end of that Greyhound after departing that Greyhound, but a perpetrator themselves, right? So it was an Italian man who was there and who lured me, to a place where he could victimize me, and it would just span out from there in a downward spiral where I became victim. And I became victim in different ways, Again, today, it's back to today, social media, is a big factor in exploitation and human trafficking currently right now. Well, back then, what do you call it? It was Yahoo chat sites. That where I was groomed and victimized on. So, it just shifts, I find it shifting continuously and rapidly, So one of the things, being a survivor, so one of the things I don't like to focus on being in that victim stage, because I'm no longer a victim no more. So one of the things is I'm like a survivor/warrior. To exploitation, human trafficking, and one of the things I do is I use my voice and my expertise and knowledge and ability to educate our First Nations communities on the subject of human trafficking and sexual exploitation. And again, going back to Canada's secret shame, in our First Nations community, this subject is a shame. It's shameful. Like, people don't want to talk about it. People don't want to have the conversation. So one of the things I do is, I'm continuously going into First Nations communities and educating on the realities of sexual exploitation, human trafficking, is one of the things, going in, because a lot of people don't know how to identify exploitation and/or human trafficking. So one of the things they use is the language that should not be used, and one of the things they do is they victim blame. So they rather blame the victim than the perpetrator/abuser that's committing this crime within First Nations communities.
Well, we'll talk a lot more about those signs coming up on the show. And I have to commend you for coming on the show and sharing some of your experiences. I can see your strength in that, so thank you so much. And we're going to continue the conversation, and that will be coming up shortly, right after the break. If you want to join the conversation, here's how. Join our conversation now. Send your thoughts in an email to infocus@aptn.ca, like our APTN InFocus Facebook page, follow and tweet us at APTN InFocus, or call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Welcome back. Let's go to social media now to hear what some of you are saying about today's topic. The question: what can you suggest doing to put an end to human trafficking? Tori Fish says tougher sentences and zero tolerance for repeat offenders. They should be nationally registered and revealed to the public when one of them are released. Donovan Searchwell says punishment should be severe, given that the victims are often young and should be to serve as examples, perhaps death penalty. And when Michelle says immediate long-term jail time, hashtag no chances, hashtag zero tolerance. Join our conversation now. Send your thoughts in an email to infocus@aptn.ca, like our APTN InFocus Facebook page, follow and tweet us at APTN InFocus, or call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Now, we want to play you another clip from the documentary Human Trafficking, Canada's Secret Shame. This is Alicia sharing her experience.
And so she phones these two guys, and then she says, okay, in this seemingly happy voice. And she says, well, all the girls that are making money are working track. And when I say track here, I'm referring to the street. So you would get ready and you would go and walk up and down the street. The only difference was I'm getting dressed in what I would normally be wearing if I was going to work or be trafficked, and which was just usually a nice dress. And she said, no, this is what you're gonna wear, and she handed me some lingerie. And I even remember my knees were buckling, like walking down the stairs to the apartment and walking up and down that street. And there was thousands of men there, that was true, but these men were just grabbing at me, gawking, catcalling, name calling, like the horrible things they were saying. And how much? That's actually the words that I can't get. How much, how much, how much, how much? Like I couldn't even turn my head. It was like not even 2 steps, and it was how much, how much? How old are you? This or that, or where are you working, or let's go around the corner, or it was just so crazy. It was surreal for me. It's nothing I'd ever experienced in the entire time that I had been trafficked. So at that point, it kind of started feeling like, am I going to be stuck in this? Like maybe nobody does care. And I went back to the apartment that night, and I cried and I cried and I cried because I had no idea, like, am I going to die tomorrow? What are these guys going to do? Because the stories I had heard about them were terrifying.
Let's go back to our guests now. Alaya, what did you think as that clip was playing? What went through your mind?
So one of the things, it's similar in nature, the clip itself, to my experience, right? And so one of the things with perpetrators, one of the things that aren't captured is those grooming stages, right? Those grooming stages in grooming them to where those perpetrators and abusers want them at, for one of the things, yes, how much, but in reality too, what's not in that documentary is how society tends to come into those core communities where those victims are at, and taunt them and abuse them also. So again, I think that's missing out of this, because it's community also that comes and abuses these victims. I remember being, out in the North End here of Winnipeg when people would literally come driving past me and not understanding, in the visible sex industry that these people are victims of a crime, and that these people feel the need to come into those communities and come and victimize these victims even more by coming to, whether it was throw beer bottles at us or rocks, drive by, throw water at us. So again, you need to capture that component also. Then also too, where they're being taken to, Also too, the underground of the sex industry, right? The underground component, that underground, isn't captured here, in the clips.
So what impacts in your life did human trafficking have?
Well, for me personally, by the time I wanted to, exit, I was damaged. I was really damaged. I didn't know how to love. I didn't know how to love myself. I didn't know, how to trust. I had so much trauma, by the time I wanted to exit. I didn't know how to deal with the trauma. So one of the things I had to do was deal with intense trauma therapy. What that looked like to me was, group therapy, going to my peers whom lived and whom were victims to that, to understand and have conversation and dialogue and talk about it, and talk freely about it. For me, those are just some steps, and not only that, but some of the things I left with, I really exited really damaged, a lot of people tend to think it's a choice to be out there. Also, people talk about choices, it was never my choice. Not one day did I wake up and say, oh, I want to be a victim of exploitation or a victim of human trafficking. It wasn't my choice. Again, it stemmed back, to the childhood trauma of child sexual abuse, and majority of victims that I know whom are, victims of exploitation and or human trafficking, stem back to that trauma of childhood trauma of child sexual abuse. And that just spans out because the layers of abuse and the trauma, one of the things I used to say was, or one of the things I used to think was, I'd rather go out there and be the shield. I'd rather go out there and be the shield and let the perpetrators pick me rather than the kids or the young ones, So that's one of the things I used to do when I was out there, There was times, there was years I couldn't look in the mirror and tell myself I love myself, because I was so damaged. And it took a lot, to get where I'm at today. If it wasn't for community, those service providers within community, giving me a hand up approach, I don't think I would be where I'm at today. And like for Joy, for example, I do work with Joy on different initiatives, and Diane Red Sky, these women actually are women to look at, and also myself when the discussions come up of sexual exploitation, human trafficking, because we are the experts at it,
And we'll talk more in the show about how to get out of it and what kind of advice, because I'm sure, Alaya, we'd love to hear your side of that story. Is there a specific time that you can talk about that really affected you?
So for me personally, one of the times was I was in Duncan, British Columbia, and really affected me and really, I guess, really planted that seed to try and exit at that time. Was I was kept in a trailer park, and I was just, I was probably up for 7 days servicing men, and this one perpetrator, had purchased me, and I wanted to sleep, and it was so discomforting. He had his way with me while I was sleeping, and that was one of my changing points. And one of the things when I was like, get, off of me, and one of the things was he's like, I'm getting what I paid for, and he's like, whether you like it or not. So for me, that was a changing point. So I was shipped back off the mainland to Vancouver, and one of my turning points was the downtown east side. That's like the poorest postal code in Canada, and just to see all of that, all of addictions, exploitation, all of that just around me. One of the things was, am I going to go home from here? And that's one of the things, for myself. Am I going to go home from here? How am I going to go home from here? Am I going to die here? Is one of the things I thought, right? And one of the things was, if it wasn't for that perpetrator that I disclosed to, who actually got me out of BC, got me out of those areas, but only to be victimized yet again. And it was a truck driver, right? And what do you call it? Only to be victimized in Calgary, staying in Calgary, at a truck stop for 2 days, and being victimized and servicing this truck driver. And one of the things, like with truck drivers, they see, women, as a sex object because they're on the road a lot, right? And one of the things in those areas where trucks stop, right? And so I was taken to a truck stop and I was told, well, I'm sorry, this is as far as I can take you, but you can get on that CB, you're guaranteed a ride. I got on that CB, within a minute I got a response. And one of the things and how they identify themselves, I don't know if they still identify themselves to this day, is serial numbers on the sides of their trucks. So I'm walking around a truck stop in Calgary looking for a serial number on a semi-truck, and lo and behold, the perpetrator opens the door and he's like, come on in, and I had went in and just to be victimized over again. And finally, when 2 days later, after I serviced this man, he started up his semi, and I felt like I was coming home, first and foremost, I was coming home. I was actually so glad, I was like, at least I can be somewhere where I know. And only to go back to it again, and up until a few months later, a year later, that I would change my life around.
Joy, you're nodding your head quite a bit. It sounds very familiar to
It's
you.
very familiar. What Alaya says is totally correct. I know when we were doing the documentary, we had 14 hours of footage, and nobody listens to something for 14 hours. We had to go down to 90 hours, or 90 minutes. And what we were trying to do was to get the story out about how it happens. But I think there needs to be a sequel, and talking about the more in-depth things that Alaya was talking about in terms of how the perpetrator victimizes and re-victimizes, and how, that's a whole different documentary. And I think now we're at a point in Canada where people are paying attention. And I think the most important people are the survivors who actually, are the peer groups where they sit around the table and they support and help. And I try to support as many peer groups as I do across the country, as Alaya knows. But the fact of the matter is the story has just begun. And one thing about this documentary, it's opened the eyes of so many Canadians. It tells the story about Canada's secret shame. It tells how it happens. And now we have to talk about the in-depth stuff. That is in-depth to a certain depth. But the survivor's voice is very important, because people can't imagine what they've gone through. They can't imagine their feelings. And I've heard Alaya say before, I got into this perpetrator's truck and I was just so happy I was going home. How sad. How sad. He got into this guy's truck. He was violated. And then the only relief he had is he was heading for home. Well, thank you very much. That child deserved much more than that. Mm-hmm. And so Canadians as a whole have to hear those stories, those survivors' stories. And you see many survivors now who are writing books. There's many survivors now that are speaking out. And I think it's very healthy for Canada, because they're surprised at who's involved. They're surprised at who actually gets trafficked. They're surprised it's boys and young men as well as girls and women. And I think Canada is opening its eyes now to this horrendous crime against our youth. And that's what I've called it. It's modern-day slavery, without a doubt.
All right, I want to get to Marley again just before we head to another break. So, Marley, what is the reality of human trafficking you can share that hasn't been talked about already?
I think it's because of all the shame and the guilt that people, they don't talk about it. And I know it's like talking in communities, if people haven't dealt with their sexual abuse, it's a very tough topic to bring up.
Have you talked to many survivors or victims about that shame and that guilt?
Well, actually, I have a page called Pack Grandmother Nokomis, and some of the victims come in and they reveal their stories to me.
Must be pretty compelling to hear those stories firsthand.
Yeah.
All right. Well, a more in-depth story on Alaya. Our web writer, Kathleen Martins, will have that in the coming days. Stay with us. After the break, we'll talk to all our guests again about rehabilitating out of the sex industry. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're talking about human trafficking, Canada's secret shame this afternoon. And I want to get back to our guest, Alaya McIvor. I'm curious to know how you got out of this sex industry.
Well, again, it took a lot of trying, a lot of attempts. One of the things I, again, will reiterate is community, giving me a hand-up approach. So one of the things is community helping me identify my gifts, and helping me identify those gifts and tools that I carried within myself. And one of the things is giving me the opportunity and showing me the opportunity and guiding me along the way, that, I had more potential than being that victim, and that I could, move mountains, sort of thing. So one of the things, it took a lot of attempts. It's not, something that's going to happen overnight. It's really in depth. You really need to work on yourself, and again, seek counseling. Work on yourself individually deep inside yourself, and find what it is that could help you better your life. So that was just one of the things. And one of the things was, that really helped me exit was, going. One of the things that really pushed me along the way is, seeing my sisters, and my brothers whom are currently actively still entrenched in exploitation and human trafficking, see them voiceless. And also to, seeing, people speak on our behalf, without our consent. So I wasn't okay with that. So one of the things, I wanted to better my life because I wanted to be there, be that person, and mentor my peers into reclaiming those roles of responsibility of being and reclaiming their voice, in them, being, the survivors.
Do you know who's exploiting your siblings?
So, what do you call it? It's not my siblings, it's my sisters and brothers. So, who's exploiting? So, it's everyone, it's like, it's, Caucasian, indigenous, it's black, it's everyone, it's everyone, and the age range, it fluctuates, right? It could be like 17 to 75, whom we're exploiting, and those whom are, seeking victims for potential personal gain, financial gain, are those whom, usually are in gang affiliated of some sort, whom feel the need to sell our women and our men.
So, Joy, I'm curious to know from you, just what do you say to people who come and talk to you, what do you say to them to try to help them to exit the sex industry?
You know, what Alaya said is very true. It's very hard to exit. And there's factors there. Number one, the perpetrators don't want them to exit. They can get beaten or worse. The second thing is they get something called Stockholm Syndrome, which is kind of a connection to the person who abuses them, because there's a big gap there that has been filled with a very mixed up kind of view of life, because the people they trusted betrayed them, and they've been abused, and at a moment's notice things could turn from being okay to being very, very violent. But the voice of the survivors is most important, because when I did my bills, a lot of survivors wouldn't talk because there were no bills, there was no protection. Now there is protection. But you know, this peer interaction, I've noticed in all the provinces with peer groups that I've worked with, just getting them together to have their peer support is really important. You know, about gaining their self-worth, knowing that they're worth something, knowing that there is a hand up, not a handout. You know, these are people with dignity. These are young people who suddenly, years later, was going down a dead-end street because they came to realize, hey, you know, I was just being used and abused every day, but I have nothing. They've lost their families. Some of them have addictions. Nobody respected them. When you talk about, you know, beer bottles being thrown at them and water thrown at them. I mean, really? As human beings, we need to have a little bit more respect for our fellow men and women, and to get out of the, when perpetrators force them into the human trafficking field, I have to say that after all those years of that abuse, they need to have their self-worth. They have to know that someone loves and cares for them.
And do you know, I'm sorry to interrupt, but yes. I'm curious to know, Alaya, do you feel that now, today? That somebody cares for you, that you have self-worth?
I have a lot of self-worth for myself, and I have a lot of people that care for me and love me dearly. And, you know, and again, you know, there's times when I forget about it, but, you know, then there's times when I need to go back to them, you know, just to rejuvenate myself, my love, my self-love, and my love that I feel from them. So that's one of the things, you know, and one of the things with survivors and victims, you know, is we self-isolate. You know, we self-isolate because that trust, you know, that trust was really broken down. Like, yeah. So for me, it's hard for me to trust, and I self-isolate a lot, right? So I just like keep to myself. Like, yeah. Mm-hmm. So and I continuously just do the work that needs to be done.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Well, let's talk a little bit more about a way out. Let's go back to the documentary and shed some hope, because there is a way out. Here's Joy in that documentary talking about rehabilitating out of human trafficking.
Fortunately, there are caring individuals and organizations that are dedicated to helping rescue and rehabilitate victims of this heinous crime. The trauma that results from being trafficked takes its toll. The cost of rehabilitating a victim of human trafficking is over $600,000 per victim. By the time they get health care, by the time they go through the judicial system, by the time they are counseled and rehabilitated, and by the time they have help to get an education so they can restart their lives, it's well over $600,000 per victim per year. So it's well worth our while to take a look at this crime and make sure that the education is out there so our youth do not get caught in it.
$600,000 per victim per year. What's been your experience working with victims? Is this funding easy to tap into, and where does the money come from?
You know, there isn't enough money to cover all the needs of the survivors. There aren't enough social workers, there aren't enough police officers, and that is why the focus of the foundation has now been to focus on the education to prevent it from happening. But alongside of that, we have to take care of the ones who have been. who have been perpetrated and who have become survivors. They need to have re-education, for instance, very practical things. The fact of the matter is, people sometimes have the idea, you know, if you give someone a meal, you've done your job, you know, good for you. You know, it's more than that. These children have lost, these young people have lost 5 years, 6 years, 7 years of education. How do they get a job that keeps them safe? How do they get a vision for what they want to be? They can't. So to rehabilitate, they have to catch that vision, and then there has to be practical money from the private sector, from government, from everyone. Because what I said in the documentary is very true. It costs so much to rehabilitate someone that, you know, really it's better, number one, to prevent it, and number two, it's even better to help the ones that are in rehabilitation have that circle completed. It's not just the peer group. It's not just they need to get a job. They need to have pride in what they're doing. And so it's a journey, a step-by-step journey. But I have faith in Canadians because now we're talking about it.
And educating. And Alaya, you yourself have been educating people in communities about it. Just briefly, can you tell us a little bit about the work that you do in that area?
Well, I go into First Nations communities. I share my story of resiliency, of you know, being a victim and overcoming exploitation, human trafficking. And one of the things is helping First Nations communities identify exploitation, because exploitation is occurring within First Nations communities. It's just helping them identify what it looks like and the proper language to use, right? And rather than, again, going back to victim blaming, rather than victim blaming the perpetrator / abuser, and also, you know, going into First Nations communities and helping them identify and work with existing stakeholders within their jurisdiction of, you know, if and when a survivor comes forward or a victim comes forward, and how they're going to work with the survivor or this victim that's coming forward, you know, how they're going to work with them in getting them out of that community in a safe and practical way, and neighboring with their existing communities within their jurisdiction. So again, you know, and I go into Ontario a lot. You know, Ontario, you know, the lady that was on Skype, you know, Ontario was, just last year, the government pumped $75 million into the initiative of exploitation, human trafficking. You know, so there's a lot of education within Ontario that needs to happen, because again, those behaviors were so normalized. You know, it was just normalized altogether, the sex industry, that, you know, now there's a lot of work to be done. You know, I am so glad and privileged enough to go into Ontario. You know, Treaty 3 continuously gets me out in their communities and to educate young women. You know, because again, you know, our young women need to be educated on exploitation, human trafficking, because again, if you're coming from a First Nations community into a city setting, you know, just that attention, you know, that attention grab, and that's one of the things I educate, and also consent, you know, you know, because again, as Indigenous people, we don't know how to say no. So, you know, and in informing them what no is no, you know, sort of thing. And also, you know, the age of consent, you know, because we're coming from First Nations communities, and, you know, again, the age of consent needs to be brought up, because those behaviors are being normalized yet again within our communities. So just helping them identify that, and, you know, going back and, you know, a few months later and asking, you know, are you still nourishing, you know, what I brought to your community.
Very important education points there. I just want to go over to Marley. We don't have that much time left, but I did want to go to you, Marley, because we did mention that some money has been poured into Ontario. Can you talk a little bit about that from your end?
Well, just recently with our, I'll check this out. Just recently with our 3-day event, we met one of the representatives from Toronto. So we're going to make a connection with her, and we're going to have our proposal ready when we bring it down to Toronto to meet the director. So, yeah, that's our plan. We're working on a no budget, and you know, this is very. We're very dedicated to this work as the grandmothers. So we do need the funding dollars to get on the go.
For sure. Well, thank you so much, Marley, for being a part of the show this afternoon and providing the input that you did. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have today to talk about this very important topic. I wish we had more time to do so. There's a lot to be said still. But I'd like to thank my guests for coming in today. Alaya McIvor and Joy Smith, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. If you would like to order a copy of the documentary, Human Trafficking, Canada's Secret Shame, you can do so by going online to thejoysmithfoundation.com. I'm Juanita Tautungi. Have a great afternoon.